Hey, it's Noel, and thanks for visiting my little corner of YouTube. Now, today's quite exciting for me because I'm going to be taking a look at my first ever planar headphone. This is the Drop, aka Massdrop HIFIMAN HE4xx. Right, so this is the Drop HIFIMAN HE4xx. And this cost me around about £180 UK, which is about the same as you'd pay for this in dollars in US. So the deal that you're going to get in the UK is not quite as good as the deal you might get in the US. Now, this is a planar magnetic headphone. Now, unlike most headphones which have dynamic drivers, these have planar magnetic drivers, which work quite differently. And these are also marketed as a fairly easy to drive headphone. Now, their biggest competition probably comes from the Massdrop Sennheiser HD6XX, which is an absolutely fantastic headphone. It's basically a rebadged Sennheiser HD650, which is legendary in the world of headphones. In my opinion, the Massdrop HD6XX is probably the best deal in audio right now. But let's look at the specs then. We have an open back with a planar magnetic driver. They have an impedance of 35 ohms and a sensitivity of 93 decibels. And that sensitivity actually makes them fairly difficult to drive considering they're 35 ohm headphones. They come with a 1.5 meter cable and they weigh a fairly hefty 370 grams. Okay, next up, let's take a look at building comfort. So they have this rather old school look to them, which I think is quite nice. They have this protein leather headband. It certainly looks the part, but it's only lightly padded on the inside. The yokes and the headband adjusters are all made of metal and they feel really quite sturdy, and they certainly give this headphone a really good quality feel. Now, the headband adjusters are a little bit annoying in that they have no ratchet mechanism. They just work on friction alone, and they tend to slide really easy. And I find that when I store them, or even when I've got them on my head, they'll be moving all the time, and I'm constantly having to readjust them because they've slid down a little bit. I only need a small amount of pressure and they start to slide. Now, I do find that this headphone can get a little bit uncomfortable for long listening sessions when it comes to its headband, because it's only lightly padded and it does weigh 370 grams. I do find I get a bit of pressure on the top of my head. It is nice that they have quite a good arch to them, so in theory, they do spread out the pressure over your head more. So how the comfort works on these is probably more about the shape of your head than anything. But I should note that 370 grams is the same weight as the Beyerdynamic DT1990 Pros, and I do not find that headphone ever gets uncomfortable for me, and I think that is due to the much better padding on the headband. And clamping force on these is not high, but it's also not light either. But I think because you have these nice deep ear pads, when it comes to comfort, the clamping force isn't really a problem. Now, the ear pads on the HE4xx are the HIFIMAN Focus Pad A, and many people consider the Focus Pad A to be a bit of an upgrade on the regular Focus pads, mainly due to increased comfort. And these are a hybrid pad design, so they have a pleather on the outside, they have a velour material on the inside, and they don't really have an internal wall. They kind of just slope all the way back, and the backings of the ear pads seem to be made of a fabric material. The pads themselves are fairly nice and deep and plush. However, the padding isn't the most springy and the most supportive. They're not memory foam or anything like that. So whilst they could be more comfortable, I didn't find that I had any issues with the comfort of these ear pads. And the Focus Pad A were originally HIFIMAN's pre-production pads. The regular production pads are known as just the Focus pads, and they have a slightly different design to these. Now, similar to these, they are also hybrid ear pads with a pleather on the outside and a velour material on the face of them, but they also have an internal wall made of a perforated pleather, much in the same way as the Brainwaves and the Deconi hybrid ear pads. And there's some debate online as to which ear pads sound better and which are more comfortable. Generally, most people tend to find the Focus A pads more comfortable. However, this all probably comes down to personal preference. So it should be noted that the Focus pads are available as an aftermarket upgrade, so you could just swap these on if you wanted to. And the ear cups themselves are really solid feeling plastic. They have this nice deep blue colorway similar to the HD6XX. And Massdrop HIFIMAN call these a soft touch. They're not like what I would traditionally call a soft touch material, but they do have this nice silky feel to them. Really feels nice in the hand. Now, the back of these ear pads are very open. They have this mesh grill, and you can just about see the driver through the grill. Now, something that I did notice is that the grill has a bit of play to it. There's a bit of movement, and they rattle a little bit. Now, I didn't notice any rattling while I was listening to them, even on some bass-heavy music, but I just thought I'd mention that because I noticed it, and for me, it doesn't really scream quality. And the ear pad yokes are hinged in the middle at the headband adjuster, and they have quite a lot of movement laterally, which means that they can adjust to sit on your ears really quite nicely. However, what I don't like is that the vertical adjustment isn't quite as smooth. They're really quite stiff to adjust. And I should also note that the yokes are screwed into the plastic body with a metal screw. Now, this might not ever be a problem, but it does give me pause for concern about their long-term durability. Onto the cable then, it's quite thin and flexible. However, I don't find that it kinks or tangles particularly easy. So at the one end, you have two 3.5mm TRS connections. It should be noted that earlier production runs of the HE4xx used 2.5mm connectors in place here. So if you are looking for an aftermarket cable for this, do note that there are two different versions. And being able to connect to the headphone at both ear cups like this does open up the option for balanced connections with an aftermarket cable, so that is a good plus point if that's the sort of thing that you're into. Now, of course, you really should be careful with your headphones and you don't ever want to drop them, but accidents do happen, and I really do shudder to think what might happen if you dropped a headphone of this weight onto these 3.5mm connectors. The last thing you would want is for these to snap off inside the body of the headphone. I mean, that might just be me being overcautious, but it is something that I worry about. Now, the cable is 1.5 meters long and terminates in a right-angled 3.5mm connector, and it also has a push-on 1/4-inch adapter. I find this a little bit weird why they didn't use a straight connector, but I think this is because they are trying to push this headphone as an easy-to-drive portable headphone. I'd much prefer to see a straight 3.5mm connector with a thread-on 1/4-inch adapter, but this is what it is. Now, I don't actually think that this headphone is that easy to drive. I'm sure they're easier to drive than the HE4xx, and they are only 35 ohms, but their sensitivity is 93 dB, which means that they do actually require a fair amount of juice to drive them. Having said that, I was able to drive them off my phone without any issue, but really these would be much more suited to being used with a headphone amp. But I do find it a little bit weird that they're pushing these as a portable headphone. I wouldn't usually consider an open back to be a portable headphone, but maybe some people like to travel with theirs. So let's move on to sound then. Now, these are my first ever pair of planar magnetic headphones, so I'm unable to draw any direct comparisons with any other planar headphone, but I can draw some comparisons with some fairly decent dynamic driver headphones. I bought the HE4xx blind. I didn't do any research on them before I bought them because I wanted to go into this without having my opinion colored by anybody else. However, one thing that I did know about planar magnetic headphones is that they're well known to have really, really good bass performance and decent sub-bass extension. However, in the case of the HE4xx, that seems to be only partially true. I'd say overall, this headphone is very rich, very warm, with a slightly V-shaped sound. If I could use just 3 words to sum these headphones up, I would say lush, spacious, and sturdy. So bass is solid and powerful. However, it doesn't extend quite as deeply as I was expecting. They do tend to roll off a bit earlier than you would think. I would say out of the box, actually, bass extension on these isn't that much more than the HD6XX or 650. It certainly has a more elevated bass, but it rolls off around about the same sort of point. Interestingly though, I think that the bass on these seems to perform much better than the frequency charts seem to suggest. I find there's an incredible amount of authority to the bass. While they're not seismic, it still feels big, full, and sturdy without ever seeming slow or muddy or bloated. Bass performance on these is really quite exceptional. And mid-range is not as forward as the HD6XX. It's not as sweet. I find that vocals on almost every track are better on the HD6XX than these. However, I don't find that these ever sound boxy or hollow. They do a pretty good job. Now, highs are interesting. They're kind of uneven. They're a bit grainy. They're not that resolving or detailed. And whilst this headphone does have a generally warm or even dark sound signature, there's quite a few peaks in the treble region, which can make them sound quite strident and even in certain tracks quite sharp and sibilant. However, treble does seem to roll off after about 10 kilohertz. So this uneven and peaky treble is actually really the weakest part of this headphone. Having said that, I think where this headphone really excels is in soundstage and imaging. The one word that I keep coming back to with these headphones is spacious. they sound incredibly open and ambient. To the point with some tracks, they almost sound too open. They sound a bit reverberant in places. Now, of course, what that means is they do excel at reproducing spacey or atmospheric sounds. They're fantastic for movies and video games. And whilst imaging is exceptional on this headphone, I think because the soundstage is so vast, they're probably not the best for competitive gaming, but for more atmospheric games or MMOs or single-player games, they are really, really awesome. I was having a blast with these whilst playing Doom last night. They really are incredible. Now, the HE4XX are really, really quite articulate. There's a huge amount of air and separation between instruments. And it's really quite unlike anything I've ever heard in any other headphone. Even the DT1990 Pro, which is well known for having decent separation and imaging. I spent quite a bit of time A/Bing these with the HE6XX and the DT1990 with my usual list of reference tracks. For example, Talk Talk by a Perfect Circle. These sound really, really spacey and lush and layered with incredible separation. Another word that I would probably use with these is rich. Now, the HD6XX beats these when it comes to clarity and sweetness in the vocal range. And the 6XX doesn't sound quite as intense, but it does sound more refined. And on Polaris by Deadmau5, the HE4XX sounded really thick with a really, really deep and punchy bass. Now, I did find in places it was almost too thick, especially during some of the synth lead melodies. The synth had a really nice warm cutting sound, but it cut much better on the HD6XX, had much more detail and clarity. I also found with the HD6XX that the kick was much more punchy on the 6XX without sounding flabby, whereas these had a much more warm sound to the kick. On Never Tell a Soul by Circa Survive, I thought these did absolutely fantastically. Circa Survive have this really layered, spacey sound as it is, so this headphone really suits that. Guitars have this really excellent cutting tone. It sounds really, really warm, and the bass is deep and articulate. It still sounds nice and warm on the 6XX, but it just has much more clarity. It has a lot more vocal presence and detail. And I also found that snare hits were much more energetic on the 6XX. Now, I'm a big fan of the Harman target when it comes to the sound signature of a headphone. Now, this headphone, as with most open back headphones, it does fall a little bit short when it comes to its bass response versus the Harman target. Now, some headphones, you can EQ it a bit, but it doesn't sound quite right. With these, they respond to EQ incredibly well. You can add a low shelf filter on these, bring that bass up, and you really, really bring out this most incredibly detailed, distortion-free bass that this is capable of. So I applied some EQ to these last night, and I was listening to Deadmau5's new album, Here's the Drop, and they just absolutely blew me away when it came to their bass performance. I have never heard on another headphone the ability to EQ the bass up so well as these. Often with headphones, if you EQ the bass up too much, it just starts to distort and it just sounds bad or bloated or muddy. With these, you EQ the bass up and these turn the bass up. Like I said earlier, I am a huge fan of the Harman target when it comes to a headphone's frequency response, but on these, I turn the bass up much higher than that, and it's so enjoyable. Right, so I measured the HE4XX on my mini DSP ears, and this is the graph that I got from that. Now, I should just preface this with a disclaimer that the mini DSP ears are not an industry standard measuring rig, and these were measured under less than ideal conditions. I have compared these graphs to graphs that other people have done, and they are representative of what the HE4XX is capable of. And the great thing about the mini DSP ears is it does allow you to make some comparisons between headphone models that have been measured on the same device. So while it isn't the most accurate measurement rig out there, it's also not $20,000, and it's also comparable from one model to the next, all measured on the same rig. There would be a few weird measurements from time to time and a few outliers, and I'll try and point those out. But this here is the HE4XX using mini DSP's HPN curve, which is similar to a lot of other curves, perhaps some of the ones that Tile has done in the past. Things do get a little bit crazy up in the treble, but I did point that out earlier that it does have quite a few dips and peaks, and it's not the most even measurement around. But I'll show you the left and the right as well. So we did have a little bit of variance, but it's not so bad. Now this is the HE4XX with mini DSP's headphone EQ curve. Now this curve is based on the Harman target curve. So the idea is that any headphone that meets the Harman target response would actually show a straight, flat line on this graph. As you can see, this one is quite jagged, especially up in the upper mids and treble region. And like I said earlier, it does miss the mark when it comes to its bass response compared to the Harman target. So this can be EQ'd out quite nicely. As I said, this headphone EQs incredibly well. But looking mostly at the mid-range area here, it looks relatively flat. This is pretty excellent up to about 1.5K. So everything from about 100 hertz to 1.5K looks pretty damn flat. Now for reference, if I bring in the HD650, which I consider to be my reference headphone, between 100 and 1K, I mean, look how much flatter the HD650 is. And it only has a little rise around 1K, and then it continues to be fairly flat again for another little while, whilst the HE4xx has a bit of a recess here. They both get a little bit uneven in their treble. The HD650 is probably a little bit more restrained, though, in comparison to the HE4xx. Then we have this big peak on both headphones above 15K, which is absolutely no problem for me because I can't hear that high. But younger listeners, well, damn you for having young ears. So as I said earlier, the HE4xx and the HD650 are kind of similar in their bass response. Obviously, the HE4xx is a fair bit more elevated by about 4 or 5 dB than the HD650, but it does roll off. It does begin to roll off around about the same sort of time. But this extra few dB above the HD650 certainly explains why it sounds that much warmer than the HD650. But one thing that should be noted is just how much more jagged the HE4xx is, or actually I don't think I've got the smoothing on this one, but it doesn't get much better when you add smoothing. There we go. So that looks much cleaner, but we're still up and down quite a lot, whereas the HD650 is really quite smooth in comparison. So I think that's enough looking at graphs. I'm going to have these graphs on my website, so if you want to check them out, I'll have the links down in the description. So before I spend the rest of the day waxing lyrical about how much I love the bass on these headphones, I'm going to go straight into my conclusion now. The Massdrop or Drop HIFIMAN HE4XX is a $180 planar magnetic headphone that I think represents absolutely excellent value for money. Now, whilst European customers don't get quite as good a deal, I still think for the £180 that I paid for these, it's still excellent value. Build quality seems rather decent, although it remains to be seen what its long-term durability is like. And we can say for certain that the long-term durability on the HD6XX, for example, is already proven. Now, in many ways, I think that the HD6XX is a better choice for most people. There are a lot of people out there that really, really enjoy these. And I think if you already own the HD6XX, there's a place in your headphone collection for these. If you're looking for a more accurate headphone, a more neutral and more detailed headphone, go for the HD6XX. If you're someone that really enjoys a warm, full, bassy and fun sound, then these will suit you perfectly. And at their price, they're an absolute steal. Right, so that's going to be it for this review then. I'm quite excited to go and start listening to these again. What do you think of the HE4XX? Let me know down in the comments. And as always, like and subscribe and all of that stuff. And thank you so much for watching. And until next time, have a good one.